Hey everyone, how's it going? Forrest here, again with another installment of my complete analysis of all of Bach's chorale harmonizations. Today we're looking at Jesu, Meine, Seelen, Wonne, which translates to Jesus, delight of my soul. Pretty interesting chorale, a couple of unique moments in this chorale that make it have somewhat of a profile that makes it its own. But other than that, really not too much to write home about in this one. A fairly typical, straightforward chorale. I'm finding that more and more as I progress through the chorales are becoming more and more typical because it's getting to the point where I've seen a lot of Bach's conventions and style. But with that being said, let's just hop right into the analysis. So 3 sharps in the key signature. We start on A major. We end on A major. I reckon we're in the key of A major for this chorale. We then move to F sharp, A, and D, which is D major in first inversion, 4/6. And then we get a bit of an interesting introductory progression here. We have C sharp, E, G sharp, and E, which is C sharp minor in root position. That is a 3 chord in the key of A major, so 4 going to 3. Pretty unusual progression there. We also have a passing tone here in the tenor before we get F sharp, C sharp, A, and E, which is F sharp minor 7 in root position, 6/7. So here we see 3 going to 6, which is a pretty typical cycle of falling fifths progression. We usually see 3 go to 4/6, which has 6 in the bass, or 3 going to 6, which also has 6 in the bass. We also see it sometimes go to 5, but I'd say 4 and 6 are the most likely destinations for 3. And then we're getting ready for our cadence here. So we would expect some type of 2 chord after this, but instead of getting 2, to be fair, we do get 2 in the bass. We have B, D, A, and D. It's very possible this is a 2/7 chord, but this is one of a couple of instances where we don't know whether or not this is a 2 chord or a 7 chord. This A here feels like a 7/6 suspension to me, which makes me feel like this G sharp is actually the root of the chord, making this G sharp diminished over B, which is 7/6. And as we're getting ready for our half cadence here, we go to a tonic triad, C sharp, E, A, and C sharp, which is just first inversion, this is A major, passing tone in the bass, and then we cadence on E. We have one of these, I don't like using the word redundant, but this repetitive phrase ending cadential structure here where we see our last chord twice, E, E, G sharp, and B. It's 5 chord root position, E major. Second phrase of the A section, we have a perfect authentic cadence at the end, and our 5 chord starts off by resolving to 1, A, E, A, and C sharp, tonic triad, root position, passing 7th in the bass, and we start the phrase off similarly to how we started the first phrase off, F sharp, A, and D. It's D major over F sharp, which is 4/6, and then we get G sharp, E, B, and E, which is 5/6, E major over G sharp, passing 7th in the melody here. And then we get a pretty interesting chord. We see another one that has like a similar rhythmic profile here in the second system, in the second phrase of the B section. But this G natural, really, despite being fleeting, it hits the ear, and it definitely has an impact on the overall harmony to me. So here it looks like we have a tonic triad here with a 9/8 suspension, right? Looks like A, E, B, and C sharp. But by the time we get the resolution, we get G natural, and this G natural shifts the function of the tonic triad. I think it gives it like a higher function, and that is 5 of 4. We see that G natural, it's the lowered 7th, and that turns it into a dominant 7 chord when fully contextualized into the harmony, which means that even though this may be a tonic triad, in your analysis or the way that you hear it, it may add additional, maybe not incentive, maybe incentive from an analytical standpoint, but it adds additional tendency to want to resolve down to this F sharp here, which is a contextually important tone in a 4 chord. But we are not going to 4, we are going to 2, we're preparing for our cadence. Probably, I would hedge my bets and say the most common chord or predominant chord that we see in perfect authentic cadences is 2, maybe even 2-6-5, but just 2 chords in first inversion in general. And here we get B, F sharp, A, and D. Sorry, D, F sharp, A, and B. I flipped my clefs here. That's 2-6-5. So this is what I've been calling a secondary deceptive progression. That is when, sort of in a roundabout fashion, the secondary dominant resolves to the 6 or to another chord. Generally it's the 6th of the scale, but it just resolves elsewhere. So in terms of D major, which A is the dominant of in this case, we have B minor, which is 2 in the key of A, but it is also 6 in the key of D. So 5 of 4 going to 2 is a roundabout way of saying 5 going to 6 in this little local D major here. And it's a relatively common progression that we see in Bach. Relatively, I mean, it's still uncommon in the sense that we don't see it in the majority of the chorales. We probably don't even see it in like 10% of the chorales, but Bach has used this progression several times in the past, or at least following the timeline of me analyzing the chorales. But yeah, it's interesting to proceed it with this G natural here. It gives the chorale a bit of a Mixolydian feel rather than a major feel. So after 2-6-5, we have E, E, G, and B, which is E major. That's our 5 chord. Typically how we would follow it, 2-6-5, passing 7th in the tenor, and then we cadence on A major, A, C sharp, E, and A. Next phrase is in the key of B minor, ends in a perfect authentic cadence, and I always think it's really cool when Bach does this, but he uses the dominant to modulate to the key of the supertonic. So here we start with 5, nothing inherently B minor like about E major yet until we see A sharp following the G sharp, and then we realize this G sharp is part of a rising melodic minor fragment in the key of B minor. So 5 here, E major, is also major 4 in the key of B minor. At least that's the way that I hear it. I think that's really awesome when Bach does that. It's a very common thing for Bach to do when modulating this way. One of the more common chords. Bach was very crafty that way. Just goes to show, like, you know, how prevalent melodic minor was in the harmonic vocabulary of the time period, or maybe just Bach in general. After 4, we get D, E, A sharp, and C sharp. This D looks like a bit of an outlier, and I think this C sharp is part of the chord, which would make this A sharp diminished over C sharp. That's 7-6 in the key of B minor, and then this little progression here ends with B minor, B, F sharp, B, and D. It's our tonic triad now that we're in the key of B minor. Passing tone in the bass, then we just take the chord and put it in first inversion, D, F sharp, B, and D. No need to reiterate the Roman numeral there. Another passing tone in the bass. And then we have F sharp, B, and C sharp. This B sharp looks like a 4-3 suspension to me. 4-3 suspensions are fairly common over dominant triads, especially in root position. This G natural, another one of these sort of neighboring G naturals here. Now it's diatonic to the key of B minor, but here it was a chromatic tone that sort of pointed us in the direction of D major. Afterwards, we get the resolution. We have F sharp, A sharp, and C sharp, which is our dominant in root position, passing 7th in the tenor, and then we cadence on our tonic, B minor. Moving on to the next phrase, we have a perfect authentic cadence again in the key of D minor. Sorry, not D minor. We're moving from B minor to D major. So we start off with another tonic triad here, and something that I like to point out stylistically is that usually, like here for example, when we have the same Roman numeral over the span of multiple beats, I won't bother reiterating it. I mean, it doesn't hurt to reiterate, like here for example as well. It also happens to be a 5 chord, but if it's the same chord, I won't add more analysis until we see a change in the chord. The only time I'll break that rule for myself stylistically is when the line breaks and we move to a new line. Here it's harder to C, the fact that we just had a B minor chord. So you could leave it out, you can put it there. It doesn't really matter. It's just something that I do stylistically that breaks the not reiterating the Roman numeral that I do on the same line. But our tonic triad here in B minor is also the 6th chord in the key of D major. And then we have A, C sharp, A, and E, which is our 5th chord, A major in the key of D major, passing 7th in the bass, and then we get F sharp, D, A, and F sharp, which is our tonic triad in first inversion, passing tone in the bass here. And here we're encountering our other instance of this little 16th note figure that tends to at least lead me to believe that this is functioning more than just a tonic, but rather a 5 of 4. So this looks kind of like a tonic, but with this C natural here and this B, this F sharp is also a non-chord tone, I'm just realizing, not really a huge deal. But this is probably D7, or this D major chord is functioning like 5 of 4, the dominant of G major. And again, we're seeing a very similar situation here. The lower voices are leading us to believe that G major is what the resolution is, G, D, and B. But the melody is changing the context of the chord here. We have now a E minor 7 chord over G, which is very similar to G major. G major and E minor 7 both have G, B, and D in common. But yeah, we're just seeing a very similar progression to what we're seeing here in the second phrase here. Not identical, but very similar. And 2-6-5 is a much more common predominant in perfect authentic cadences. A lot more common than 4 chords, actually. But yeah, perfect authentic cadence here, we would expect 5 afterwards, which we do get. A, C sharp, A, and E. A major, passing 7th of the alto, and then our phrase ends with D major like we would expect, D, A, F sharp, and D, which is our tonic triad, D major. Alright, second to last phrase here, we have a phrase that ends in the key of A major, so we are going to modulate back to the key of A major, but we have this interesting middle section here with the G natural, the A sharp, and the B, which is kind of an interesting thing. I think that in the middle of this phrase we get a modulation to B minor, despite the fact the phrase starts in the key of A major. I hear this D major as sort of like a part of a plagal progression to the key. Yeah, I'm going to stick with that. Sorry, I forgot about this G natural here. If this was this G sharp here, if this were a G natural, I would say we were still in the key of D major, but really with that leading tone in the key of A, this really feels like a 1 chord where we're just emphasizing D in an A major context. So we have A here, A, E, and C sharp, passing 7th in the bass, and then we go to our 4 chord in first inversion. One of the things that makes me feel like this is in the key of A major, and something that's, at least to me, important in terms of helping you or helping me with analysis when it's like a toss-up and you're getting towards the end of something and you already have analyzed material that you're confident with, is that you could look back to your previous material or your previous analysis and see if there's any commonalities between what you're analyzing here and what you analyzed before. So this kind of looks like the key of D major. This G sharp could just be an anomaly, but the reason why I feel like this little fragment's in A major here has a lot to do with the beginning of the first 2 phrases, right? We have 1 going to 4-6, and here this looks a lot like 1 going to 4-6 in the beginning of the first 2 phrases of the A section. So this D major chord here doesn't really look like our tonic anymore, especially with this G sharp there. It looks more like our subdominant. F sharp, A, and D, 4-6, which coincidentally, even though this little section here looked like, we were going to stay in the key of A major until the end of the chorale, I do think we are briefly going to visit B minor, not quite as briefly as we stayed in A major there, but we'll cycle back. We'll cycle back to the key of A major. So this D major chord in first inversion is now our 3 chord, and then we have 3-6 going to 4-6, G, B, E, and E, this passing tone here in the alto. This is E minor, first inversion. Bit of an interesting chord to have following a 4 chord is this minor dominant, right? If we were thinking in A major terms, this would be borrowing from A minor, which typically we see E major chords in general, but that's kind of an interesting juxtaposition of chords and kind of a signal that I think we've moved from the key of A, because it wouldn't be very stylistic of Bach to do that. And then we also get the leading tone of B afterwards, so we have a lot of indicators telling us that we've moved away from the key of from A, and we've now moved to the key of B. We've also seen A move to B in the past as well, so we have license to expect that, I guess, for it to be on the table. But after 4-6, we would expect some type of dominant at this point usually, or a tonic chord. But in this case, we get a dominant. We have A sharp, C sharp, G, and E, which is 7-7. A sharp fully diminished. We've seen this in B minor 2 following a 4 chord as well. And then here, in my opinion, is the most interesting point of the chorale, and we haven't had something like this in a while, but I feel like it used to be a lot more common. I might be just making that up, but here we have effectively a tonic triad, right? We have B, C sharp, F sharp, and D, and we know with tonic triads it's very common to have 9/8 suspensions as the something that sort of leads into the root position tonic triad. But by the time we get the resolution to the tonic, or I guess just the resolution to the 9/8 suspension, we get G sharp here in the alto, which changes the overall role, or I guess the overall structure of the chord. It turns it into G sharp diminished. So this is a situation where 2 and 7 are ambiguous. I've been calling it in my notes 2-7 ambiguity. Sometimes Bach tonicizes 2 and then it morphs into 7. And the only reason why it's interesting to me is that 2 to 7 progressions are never as clear as 4 going to 5, or 2 going to 5, or 4 going to 7. 2 going to 7 is like the anomaly of predominant and dominant progressions in Bach. We just don't see it in the same context. We never see them used in cadences, or very seldom do we. I think maybe Bach has done it once or twice. There's always some type of grain of salt, and they're always sort of hidden, and I think it has to do with the nature of 2 and 7 being so close to one another, because of their pitch content. Sorry, I lost my train of thought there. So even though this is functioning like 1, we know that Bach does a lot of 9/8 suspensions over tonic triads. I feel like in the key of A, this could be 2, but this also could be 7-6. So it's very difficult to say how this chord is functioning. I think it makes sense that Bach is sort of just eliding and shifting the focus of the chord. I don't really feel like this is a 2 to 7 progression, really, because the 2 chord never really fully realizes it's like a contrapuntal morphing of chords. Like 1 chord gets introduced while we expect the resolution to the 1 chord, so it's in flux, and Bach subverts the harmonic expectation here. So an interesting point, 2-7 ambiguity, something that has was more common in some of the earlier analyses that I did, but not something that's been popping up recently. I feel like that's more of a coincidence than anything else. But regardless, our 7 chord also goes to 1. We have C sharp, B, E, and C sharp, which is a bit of a 3 chord-ish. I feel like really this is just a 7-6 suspension, and really this is just a 1-6 chord actually, but it could be a 3-7 chord depending on how you look at it. But by the time we get the resolution, right, this tenor is really throwing a wrench in our ability to just pick out the chords straightforwardly. But what we have here on the end of the beat is the resolution to our previous chord, along with D and F sharp. So with that A and that C sharp, that turns our 1 chord into a 4-7 chord that leads us into 5. It's very common to see 1 lead into 4-7 in this ascending configuration as a subdivided chord progression, especially in this sort of half cadential situation as well, where we end the phrase on 5. E, E, G sharp, and B. And that leads us into our last phrase. So yeah, this phrase was definitely, I feel like, the hallmark of this chorale. If not these little 16th notes here that give us the secondary deceptive progressions, it's definitely this phrase here that's a bit of an anomaly. I'm not entirely sure what's going on here, but I have a hunch that it really just has to do with the suspension going on in the tenor and how it displaces the rest of the chords. But afterwards, we do end our chorale in the key of A major. No more modulations for the rest of the chorale, and the harmony for the last phrase, as you can see, no chromaticism here, fairly straightforward. 5 resolves to 1, A, E, A, and C sharp, A major. A is a chord tone, so we don't need to mark it. We then have G sharp, F sharp, A, and D. Again, a phrase starting off with 1 going to 4, 6. This G sharp being an accented non-chord tone. This is D major over F sharp. And then we go to 5, 6, G sharp, E, B, and E. E major over G sharp. E is a chord tone, G sharp is a chord tone, D is a passing 7th, and then we move to A major, A, E, A, and C sharp, which is our tonic, of course. C sharp briefly takes our chord and puts it in first inversion there while leaving the rest of the chord intact. I tend to mark those in my videos because a lot of the time, like this E7 chord, for example, gets rid of the B, which in fairness, it doesn't need the B for context. We see fifthless 7 chords all the time, but when it's a byproduct of the voices moving off of the harmonic rhythm, it changes the notes that are involved. So I only really mark the ones that are entirely intact after the fact. Those are the ones that are interesting to me, not that it makes a tremendous deal. But as we close out the chorale, we have D, F sharp, A, and B, which is 2, 6, 5. It's B minor 7 over D. We know that Bach loves 2, 6, 5 chords, especially over or in cadential contexts. B is a chord tone, so we don't need to mark it. We then have a 5 chord afterwards, like we typically expect after a 2 chord in a cadential context. E, E, G sharp, and B, passing 7th in the tenor, and of course we end on 1, A, C sharp, E, and A. And that's today's analysis. So really, the big takeaways are secondary deceptive progression here, where the tonic is operating as 5 of 4 as well. It's always interesting in major keys because we need that flatted 7th in order to know that the tonic is functioning as the dominant of the subdominant. We have mid-phrase modulation here where we go from A to B minor and then we go back to A, which is kind of interesting. We see that from time to time, but it's relatively rare, where we briefly deviate from the key that we started with and then we end in the key that we started with. And then what else? We have this 2-7 ambiguity here where 2 turns into 7, and then we have morphing going on. I think it has to do with these suspensions going on in the tenor here. But other than that, I think that's pretty much everything I wanted to talk about in this particular chorale. So I'm going to cap the video off on that thought. If you're interested in following me along on the journey to analyze all of Bach's chorale harmonizations, feel free to subscribe to the channel. You can hit the notification icon as well and like the video if you enjoyed the content. Thank you so much for watching the video and supporting the channel by doing so. I look forward to tomorrow's analysis, and I hope you take care.